Good afternoon, folks. My name is Richard McCoy, and I am with the organization Landmark Columbus Foundation. Welcome to the Republic Building, and welcome to the start of Mapping the Middles. We're super excited you're here. This is a really big day for us in a way. It's an awesome partnership that our organization is doing with Indiana University and Ball State University and all of the University Design Research Fellows. It's a great opportunity for us to expand the conversation about design and research in the Midwest and across the country, and we're awfully proud to be hosting it. We created the University Design Research Fellowship about 5 years ago with really the help of Janice Shimizu and her partner Josh Coggeshall and Kelly Wilson. And this day is a kind of dream come true for us. We always had thought creating the university projects would give us an opportunity to think about what universities are doing around research and design and how that affects everyone's lives and hopefully makes towns better. And so thanks to Janice and Josh and Kelly for the original ideas for it. So this is an important conversation. I'm going to introduce the two deans in a second, but I just want to say we're listening also as an organization. We have our board members are here today, the board chair and vice chair are here. There's other leaders in town. This is an important conversation, and so thank you for coming. Thanks to all of the curators and everybody for their work to get us to this day. It's a really big day, so thanks. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the two deans, Peg Feynman, the Dean of Indiana University, and Andrea Schwartz from Ball State University. Welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and Richard's correct that this is a wonderful culmination of a long-held vision, and it's a vision that's very collaborative in nature, and that's part of who we are as Indiana University and the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design, and especially the J. Irwin Miller Architecture Program. So we are very pleased to be able to host you in the Republic Building this morning, or this afternoon. This is fantastic to see old friends and new friends here in the room together. So we're going to have a really deep and rich conversation about design research. I want to thank Exhibit Columbus. I want to thank our partnership with Ball State University and all the other universities as part of this program, because it's really, it has enriched and enlivened a lot of aspects of what's going on with our whole community. There's so much to value in this partnership, and so I just want to really extend my gratitude and appreciation for everything that everyone has done to make this possible. The Exhibit Columbus program as a whole, and today specifically. I want to thank the teams that have put together a lot of hard work to make this possible, all the details, all the planning, and everybody knows, I'm sure a lot of people in the room have planned events like this. You all know how difficult it can be to put all those details together into a really successful program. So we're glad to have gotten to this day, and so we can really sit back and enjoy all the wonderful thinking that we'll hear today. I want to also talk a little bit, very briefly, about the fact that the J. Irwin Miller Architecture Program is a part of the design research that goes on in the Eskenazi School as a whole. We have many design disciplines within the school, and there's a lot of rich research going on in Bloomington as well. And so I'd like to let everybody know about that as just the holistic vision of what the school offers. So we're really looking forward to how this proceeds in the future. Where does all of this conversation, activity, the events of today, where does it take us into the future? And I look forward to future conversations with Richard and the team to build upon this great foundation. Again, I thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, and thank you to IU and Exhibit Columbus. It's wonderful to be here representing Ball State. And I liken this to my only moment that will be close to an Oscar acceptance speech. Again, starting with the thank yous for the hard work of all the design research fellows. I think what you produced is tremendous, and it's wonderful to see. And the community that's accepting of all this attention every year, it seems like. And so wonderful community, and thank you for your support in that regard as well. Thank you, IU, for this beautiful building. Wonderful. And again, the idea of the whole program of design research is something that we take to heart at Ball State. And again, appreciate the opportunity for 3 cycles now of our faculty being able to do their work, share it with others, and grow. So thank you for that opportunity. It extends what we're trying to do back in Muncie. Thank you to all the steering committee, Richard, Janice, Ann, and everybody, Ann and Kevin as well. And then finally, this is for Natalie, who's our current research fellow, Natalie Yates, in the Landscape Architecture Department at Ball State, who seems to have enjoyed spending every waking hour for the last, I'd say, 5 months. I follow her passively through Instagram and could see that she's very invested. And she is appreciative of the work of 4 of her students, Amelia, Celeste, Nathan, and Rainer. I don't know if you're here, but again, she couldn't have done it without you. So thank you, and appreciate it, and hope you enjoy the show.
Come on up. We're not as tall as everyone else is.
Hi, I'm Janice Shimizu. I'm Associate Curator for Exhibit Columbus and Assistant Professor at Ball State.
And I am Ann Surak. I'm the Director of Exhibit Columbus, and we wanted to welcome you. We're so happy to have you here. Exhibit Columbus is a program of the Landmark Columbus Foundation, and our mission is to care for, celebrate, and advance the cultural heritage of Columbus. And so we're really excited to work with Ball State and IU to create this first colloquium. This is our first effort, and we've had a great committee of people come together to make this happen with our fellows and our curators and everyone involved. So thank you for that. A special thanks to IU for hosting us in our Plan B rain blackout, but it's like the perfect space to have this conversation in. So I think it was meant to be. There's so many people in our community that support our work. A lot of them are here today. I'd like to especially thank, our Design Legacy supporters, without whom we couldn't do this work, especially to Cummins Inc., who's our 2021 exhibition sponsor. Thank you so much for your continued support over the past 6 years. And then, to Archinect and Bustler, our media supporters, we have a great article that just came out the other day, really celebrating the fellows' work and allowing them a chance to acknowledge all the people that helped make their projects happen. So thanks to Archinect and Bustler. And then to Ball State University for recording our conversation today. It's nice to have a record of these conversations and share that with others in the future.
Thanks. So as we begin this day of celebrating fellowship and design, let us take a moment to acknowledge and to reflect on a long history of a city named for Christopher Columbus in a state named for Indians. The land where Columbus, Indiana was ceded to the United States in 1818 in the Treaty of St. Mary. And yet this place has been a site of human activity for more than 12,000 years through the rich and vibrant cultures of the Adena, the Hopewell, Cahokia, Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, and Delaware nations. And we recognize that the languages, cultures, and traditions of these nations continue to this day and are entwined by land, water, and soil. And so, what is the future of the Middle City? And this is asked with the belief that design is critical in shaping a healthy, resilient, and equitable future for everyone. Based on the goals of Exhibit Columbus to educate, activate, and inspire, the colloquium strengthens the University Design Research Fellowship as a key component of this program. And this collaborative program builds upon Columbus's legendary commitment to quality of place through design excellence in education.
Okay. So, this event really celebrates design education and the fellowship. It's a network of institutions, diverse teams, and these research-based installations that you'll learn more about today, all sort of developed under this 2021 exhibition called New Middles. Framed within this curatorial vision, the colloquium considers the many ways that these participants' research use mapping as a tool or process to examine, reveal, and represent. And those were really important words that our committee thought carefully about. Every new design research inquiry, it helps make the future of the middle and inspire the next generation. And so that, again, is very important to us to consider. So now I'd like to welcome our first panelist to take the stage. Moderating the conversation today is Ann Hildner, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture at Ball State University. Ann, come on up. So prior to her academic tenure at Ball State, she was an associate senior designer and project manager at Rundell Ernstberger and Associates. Ann will be joined in conversation today with Exhibit Columbus co-curators Mimi Zeiger and Iker Gill. Iker is the director of Mass Studio, a collaborative architecture and design firm. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of Mass Context, and is the executive director, of the SOM Foundation. He was the associate curator of the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. Mimi is a LA-based critic, editor, and curator. She was also the co-curator of the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale, and her writing has been published widely. Mimi teaches at SciArc and also at the Art Center College of Design. So welcome our co-curators to the stage. Thank you.
Hello. Here we go.
You're good.
I was afraid.
Am I good?
I just wanted to say, for those of you who are registered landscape architects, there you can get credit, continuing education credit. The paperwork is back on the glass table in the back. So make sure you put your name, email address. If you don't know your CLARB number, that's okay. I can get in touch with you later. Also, you need to fill out an evaluation form. So, welcome to our curatorial team. I thought it would be a good idea to start out by you reiterating the big picture, New Middles and the future of the middle cities. And I am going to talk more specifically about what we mean by mapping in the context of this larger curatorial theme.
Everyone's looking at me. Thank you, Anne. Maybe before we get into the larger theme, is just to give a huge round of thanks to the whole Exhibit Columbus team, the participants, the folks from IU and Ball State who have put this together. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be back in Columbus with this work again. I was watching the wonderful videos that the participants put together and that are live on Archinect last night, and getting a little teary because I think the work is so thoughtful, and so I'm excited to be here today to sort of talk about it. So I'll do the little sort of shout outs at the top. But to think about this theme, it is to think about, like, what is place, right? What does it mean to be situated in a very particular place like Columbus? But then how does that localized condition connect to the rest of the world? And so now we have our right on cue, Jamie, thank you. I think one of the big tasks that we began when we first started thinking about what would be the appropriate theme to sort of go forward with was thinking about how do we define where we're at, And what does it mean, to be in the Midwest? What does it mean to be in the center of the country, or the center of a kind of geography? And then thinking about, well, what does it mean to be in an ecology, right? Like, what is this that we're sitting in? And ultimately began to think about the watershed as this sort of figure that we're not so familiar with. This kind of outline of some of the top from the headwaters all the way to the Gulf. What is this figure? And when we think about the figure of this, we see that there is Columbus sits kind of right in it, like we're kind of in the heart of the watershed, and we're connected from here. And so thinking about how one creates place from a local, but then how those local moments, those local moves of design begin to become connected up and downstream throughout the whole of the watershed.
Yeah, and I think this is, hi everybody. This is a great, it's the third edition of Exhibit Columbus, and the first two look at Columbus in a certain way. And when we think about Columbus, we look at it in its own conditions. So I think this was an opportunity to concentrate on Columbus, but also place it in the context of a larger geography, and begin to think about what is unique from Columbus, but also what are the challenges that are specific to a place like Columbus that also are shared by other places that we might not look when we're thinking about Columbus. So I think the idea of using the Mississippi watershed and thinking about ecological systems and going beyond political boundaries allows us to establish relationships that we wouldn't do it in other ways. So I think this was a great way to think about what the Middle is, what are the challenges that it faces, what are relationships between places that we haven't discussed before, and then what is the future of a place like Columbus that has an incredible civic legacy of architecture. A building like this one, for example, but then that's situated in the 20th century. Like, what happens now in the 21st century? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities for places like Columbus to position that mentality in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think there's, we can get to more of this, but I think there's a way of thinking about the middle as a spatial condition, but also thinking about the middle as a temporal condition. So what Iker is sort of getting at is we're in the middle of time. And I think for the projects that you see represented in the show, as well as the kind of curatorial framework, we're thinking about what is the past, often deep pasts, indigenous histories, geologic histories. They come up in many of the projects, more recent 20th century archival histories. And then how does this rereading of these histories set a different trajectory forward, right? It's very, we're talking about kind of the middle of the country, but it's important to note that the title of the show is Middles with an S on it. And thinking about plurality as a way of thinking about the future, that there isn't a single ideology, a single design thinking, any single charismatic person, right, who's going to take us into the future. But there's many ways of putting that together.
Well, I think the idea, when you talk about boundaries, I guess what I appreciate so much is that we're thinking of watersheds as boundaries. And I know in at least one of the pieces in particular, that's very distinctly expressed, boundaries as ecological boundaries as opposed to political boundaries, that I think is so important to bring to awareness. So I appreciate that you've you frame this in that way.
I think maybe also thinking about like Derek's project and the work that Ginny Hanusik has done around the idea of the Mississippi Watershed, it's also that it's not a given, that this is all like a manufacture, infrastructure, and re-envision. So I live in Chicago. We connected to the Mississippi, to the watershed. We're not typically connected, but we decided we did. So it's like, there are all these things that this is always in construction, like we're redefining how we relate to the watershed, how a place relates to the rivers, to their infrastructure. And that's something that we don't have to take for granted. And a lot of the things that people do reshape that relationship, and sometimes for the gains of some and the loss of many others. So I think kind of like maybe throwing out there that the Mississippi watershed, as we understand, is not necessarily this natural environment that it's pristine.
And I think we've got that slide up of the different participants. The figure of the watershed, is what it is, and it also becomes, metaphoric, right? This figure of the middle, but it also became a way of situating designers, or thinking about like how this group of designers, many are related or sort of sit within the figure of the watershed, or work within practices that take up themes that are related to conditions of habitat or ecology, infrastructure. And so, thinking about, say, how do we depict that, we including the wonderful 5 Miller Prize participants, our 7 UDRF fellows, but also our 2 photography fellows, David Shalio and Regina Hanusuk. One at the kind of head of the Mississippi, and one at the foot, or at the Gulf. And looking at how we present, back to mapping, right? We could look at it as a map, but then we also have to look at the kind of the social conditions on the ground. What is that territory? And how do we make visible, and this is going to be the theme for the day, right? How do we make visible the kind of conditions that are at eye level and are at a kind of an embodied level? So those pieces, each of the pieces of the show, these kind of 3, 4 if we count our graphic designer Jeremiah too, each are trying to kind of tackle this question of middleness from a kind of a different point, and maybe propose a different kind of mapping at each point.
Yeah, so just to explain how we came up with the idea, the title for this colloquium, Mapping the Middle. We were inspired by, James Corner, landscape architect, Dirt Studios. And specifically, I don't know if any of you have read his article, The Agency of Mapping, which I would recommend. So, this we're thinking of this, suggesting that this collection of installations is a collection of maps, expressions in response to this curatorial theme, and thinking of mapping not only as a way of representing that which exists, but as an act of revealing what could be, and in some cases what has been, and as a way of informing what could be. So the installations are really an intersection of the design research that the fellows have been engaged in the context of this this new middles idea. And we're familiar with mapping in sort of the, in the conventional sense. And it's a fantastic cultural practice. I've always been really fascinated with maps. Help us navigate the world we currently live in, but also helping to navigate the future and the potential for the futures.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and I also wanted to say, I'm a Midwesterner. I have always lived in the Midwest, except for a short stint in Eugene, Oregon. I kind of kick myself for not staying there. I don't know why, but I was drawn back to the Midwest. And I don't know who said this. Somebody said this. If there were no middle, there would be no coasts. And I guess in some respects, as a practicing landscape architect, I sometimes have to apologize for, and I live in the Midwest, yeah, I think it's really important to exhibit, to highlight, reveal a lot of what's going on in the middle, as opposed to the coasts.
Well, to say, I'm obviously not from the Midwest, but I've lived 16 years in Chicago. And I think there is something that, I mean, you kind of like said it, like, if you don't have the middle, you don't have the coast. And it's like, well, I think we need to make sure that we don't always have to evaluate one place based on the other one. I think there are many conditions that are so unique that they can define, leapfrog, advance certain places, and everybody has a different model to do that. In a way, the 20th century, Columbus did it one way with the foundation, and it did. I grew up in Bilbao. We did it a different way, but we didn't follow the model of Madrid or Barcelona. We don't have the economy, we don't have the population, we just did it different. And to me, that is important, is like that you understand what is unique to you, but also what is in relationship to other places. And in this case, we're looking at the idea of the Midwest. But maybe the conversation is not here, the Midwest with like a coast or another thing. It's just what are places that share certain conditions that it's important to have in conversation. And I don't know what those places are. It's a large network, but I think that's where the potential of positioning this project is. And there's a lot of value in the Midwest. It's just finding like how do we want to talk about it? How do we want to represent? How do we map it? And how do we engage with that the same way that other people in other places will do it in their own conditions?
Yeah, I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up in the Bay Area. I've spent most of my time on one coast or another. And I think one of our very, very initial sort of impulses was to avoid the idea of flyover. That 30,000 foot view down on the quilt, the patchwork, right, that everyone loves to romanticize, is quite frankly like not the truth of this place. That it is a kind of mapping that is a false mapping. It's similarly like I think we really wanted to avoid political maps that might ascribe color to various sort of states, right? Especially in the the year that we've been working at, or whether something is bright yellow or bright red, based on COVID numbers, right? I think those kinds of mappings are not particularly helpful when thinking about the kind of embodiment of a place. I'm a writer as well as a curator, and a few years ago I had the opportunity to interview the artist Robert Irwin. And he lives in San Diego. His studio is like on the side of the freeway in a like next door to like where some like a storage places, and like I can't really tell the difference between the storage place and like Bob Irwin's studio. And so you kind of find your way to this place. And in it, he talks about place. And I was asking him about how his approach to site. And he says that he goes to a site, any new site, right? You're a big fancy artist, you get to go do things like that. And he basically stands in one place and then walks it like a spiral outward. Right? Like this is a kind of mandala or meditative practice or artistic way of gleaning information. And if we take that kind of physical mapping and think about like the work that's going on here, I know that all of our participants, even when they couldn't necessarily make it here physically, right? Like have done archival work, have done hours and hours of Zoom calls, done readings, have applied lessons from their own research ongoing, and to this sort of way of sort of making that, maybe, I'm getting a little woo-woo here, but that kind of moment of like understanding, so ways of kind of making embodied knowledge. And those are things that stay both in the body, but also stay in the place. It doesn't have to be the physical design piece, like that memory continues.
That it reminds me of what inspires me about mapping. William Least Heat Moon, Prairie Earth. He was the fellow that coined the term deep mapping. And I don't know if you're familiar with Prairie Earth, but he did, and it's a narrative map, right? It's all narrative. And did something similar to that, just, took a deep dive into a particular place that may have been in the middle of nowhere, but the middle of everything, right? So, are you signaling 2 minutes? Okay. Let's see. No. Any questions? I wanted to, I found this quote by a psychogeographer, Kanarinka. The world today needs no representations, it needs new relations and new uses. In other words, it needs new events, inventions, actions, activities, experiences, interventions, infiltrations, ceremonies, situations, episodes, and catastrophes. And I don't think we've had catastrophes, but I think that's what we, that's kind of what the collection that we have here.
We may maybe not have catastrophes, but I think there's certainly responsiveness in the work to urgencies, whether those are urgencies of social conditions and equity or urgencies around climate and habitat. I think some of them are more overt than others, but I think there is indeed a need to reckon with the world as it is. I would probably say like none of the projects that are represented here are solutions, right? Like no one is trying to like solve climate change with architecture. But I do believe that the work is sort of thinking around methodologies, representation, all of the kind of, the backup singers to solutions, right? And that it also is sort of capturing an imaginary. Like, can we seed
exactly
a question here that
right.
might not be the right question later, but like that there is a kind of curiosity that is seeded with the work.
Suggestions, imagination, yes, absolutely, I agree.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Mimi and Iker and Anne, so much for that conversation. It's a great way to start it off, asking questions, and I think that's important. So our next conversation will be with our first panel of University Design Research Fellows. So if I could invite you to come to the stage, Derek Hoferlin of Washington University in St. Louis. I'll just stop. Okay, there we go. Ursula and Stephen, Ursula Krippa and Stephen Mueller from Texas Tech University at El Paso, and Natalie Yates of Ball State University. Joining Ann Hildner as a moderator in this session is going to be Kevin Klinger, also of Ball State University. Kevin is an associate professor of architecture at Ball State. He was the founding director of Ball State's Institute for Digital Fabrication. He served as a 2-time president of Acadia and served as one of 3 symposium co-chairs in our inaugural 2016 Symposium Foundations and Futures. So thanks everyone for being here today.
So I thought maybe Kevin could start. He has a little different take on mapping than I just explained, and I thought it might be interesting to hear.
Sure.
The explorer, you the explorer.
Thank you, Anne. I'll start off by saying it's a great privilege to be up here with the 4 of you because the work that you have all done is really quite inspiring and amazing, and so thank you for allowing me to sit here and have a conversation with you, Derek and Stephen and Ursula and Natalie. And also greetings from the middle where we make things. 100 years ago, 50% of everything made in America was made here in the Midwest. It's another sort of map that needs to be drawn. The act of mapping leads to the charting of new territories. In this spirit, the following group of thoughtful design research projects are closely aligned in their charted territories. Just like the Mercator projections of the great age of exploration, these designer collaborators are employing devices and instrumentality to frame new questions for a productive future here in the middle. Collaboratively, we reveal that change is the only constant in life. How we understand where we are now, who we are now, and how we fabricate and inhabit our new world with our bodies, our minds, in time, in space. It's fundamentally different now. Information, materiality, politics, beauty. They're all mapped potential guides in this collection of projects that serve to chart new trajectories and lead us to unexplored lands. In each of these projects, plans, sections, elevations, sure. XYZ coordinates, models, they've been augmented through the use of a critical interrogation of innovative technologies for analysis, for synthesis, LiDAR, right? Multispectral imaging, drone image capture, however it's done. CNC production, water jets, structural analysis, and other hardware and software. And these multi-layered collaboratives have joined together with rapid prototyping, iterations, problem solving to help shape the questions for our future. To this end, it is our great privilege to engage in this discussion about this future with this panel of expert designer explorers. Yes, indeed. As such, we have framed our provocations to steer the conversations to that end. We are in new territory and productive territory. So I'd like to kick things off with a question. As the archive of your work is a productive map, what specifically for each of your projects is the territory of your investigation? We'll start with Derek.
Let's make sure this works first. Okay. I was joking with Natalie earlier about this, and I said the world, maybe, as a territory, and I don't mean that as hubris, but the work with my installation with the watershed, so more specifically the territory of the Mississippi Watershed, just to be really literal about it, and my research is done within a global comparative context. So even zooming further out from what we're talking about today, my work, I can only understand where I'm from, meaning St. Louis, where I'm born and raised, with other places around the world, other watersheds. So I think it even needs to broaden out to, like for places like me, I look at the Mekong and Rhine watersheds too, which first sound completely different in context to the Mississippi, but they're very shared methods, specifically of control across those two watersheds as well, that provide lessons back and forth. So I would say, yeah, the territory of the Mississippi watershed, which is gigantic, but then even larger than that.
Sure. I'll jump in. I think our work has many different answers to this question. Maybe one answer, I'll give one answer, you might give another. I think one answer might be that the territory of our exploration always revolves around this sort of idea of the blind spot, or the gap between a kind of known territory, or the kind of the territory that exists between territories. So that applies to our work on the US-Mexico border, where we conduct several experiments and analyses in environmental justice that tries to sort of span the gap, or span the divide, and map a territory that is shared across the international boundary. It also relates to our work, of which our installation here, the installation we call Spectral, which is about multispectral imaging and providing a space to protect against that. That's related to our work, which is really invested in this territory between, I would say, military and security technologies and civilian life and public space. We find that to be a very urgent territory that is in need of intervention by designers in order to sort of recapture the idea of productive public space and freedoms in public space. Maybe I'll just start there.
This is great, because I was going to say our territory is mapping power and power structures, and I feel that Stephen probably provided the definition to that kind of singularity. But we're constantly looking at flows of the different flows of power and how they're enabled by policy. So scanning through congressional hearings, budgetary appropriations, the ways in which policy from the very top sort of enables territorial manipulations through funding and kind of supportive sort of militarization of space, then to take that information and literally map it and turn it into this sort of like geolocated collection of decision-making processes that are meant to control environments with specific goals in mind. That's really what we're working against, or to sort of to image. And so if it were to be a sort of synthesized into a sentence, the territory of our mapping is the power and power structures.
I feel like that one's hard to follow, but I also feel like I agree there's so many different answers at any given time to this this question. At the moment, mine goes to space and time, and my research and my teaching usually focus on time-based media and thinking in time. And so, if we think about territory, is it related to place? Does it have a landscape involved in it? Yes, no, maybe. And I think that for me, I've always been working in the Midwest, so the Midwest is definitely a territory. Indiana is a territory. But also, where and how you situate yourself in time is a territory. And I think when I think about the project Calibrate, which is what my project is about how we recalibrate our centers and our middles depending upon the information that we have at the time. And so it's constantly shifting, and it kind of goes back to that idea that everything is constant, the only constant is change, right? So briefly, short space and time.
So I'm wondering how are you planning on building upon? I assume this is part of your design research interests, and how are you planning on building upon that which you've done here? And also, how does it affect your methodologies, your teaching methodologies? With Natalie, I wonder, how do you get your students to interpret the signatures that are drawn on your map? You mentioned that you wanted this to be part of their design process, so leading into a particular design project. How does this machine help them, and how do you help them interpret?
Oh, good question.
That was kind of a lot of questions.
Yeah, like what did I say? What would I say? I guess maybe kind of going back a little bit, like thinking about this as part of research. One of the fantastic things about Exhibit Columbus and the UDRF in particular is that it's an opportunity, I think, to do research projects from a university academic standpoint that we might not otherwise be able to do. Typically we're in the classroom, we're teaching, writing, thinking, conceptualizing. But this is something that a passion project that you can take and manifest something that can then push you forward. And I think for me, that's, a really important part. And how does that translate into the classroom? It gives you something to build on in terms of a process. How do you help the students interpret it? I don't know, because I don't know that there's a right way to interpret anything, right? That interpretations are very subjective. And again, it depends on what information you have at the time. But I hope the process is what you take from it and what I can pass on, right? That we can think about time. We can think about timelines coming together and creating differences, and hopefully thinking about how those connections are made through not just local conditions, but also broader and larger conditions.
Ursula, how do you build on what you've done here? Where do we go from here?
So we're this small installation kind of follows a trajectory of a decades-long research project that became a book, and then currently will become an online sort of the first geospatial database of these training sites that we're interested in, constructed by the U.S. military for urban warfare training. And so the spectral installation here is really like a constructed manifestation of an idea that helps us understand the future of urban form and how urban environments might start to sort of project their own thermal imaging or heat signatures towards a different idea of an inhabited building or inhabited architecture. And so we've been as we were installing this piece, we're also kind of asked to write about it a certain way for another outlet. And so we've been really finding that this became really a lever through which we can really understand agency as it is being imaged and mapped, who controls those images and those maps, but also how they might really have consequences in how we imagine urban form or architectural typologies and how they might be kind of rendered transparent or materialized in certain ways to shield or to produce certain kinds of heat signatures. So this project has really helped us kind of take the really sort of much larger body of research into urban military strategies and really think about like material assemblies, typologies, and things like that. And so within any of those steps of thinking, you can insert student learning objectives, whether they're undergraduate or graduate studios or theory seminars where there are moments where architecture becomes a tool or becomes a shield.
Maybe just to add to that briefly, I think one of the key words that was mentioned at the onset of this discussion was the idea of revealing, right? And I think what's prevalent in our work and what continues sort of as a through line through this project is the idea of tapping into what we describe as the sub-perceptual spectrum, right? The idea that we as human observers get to experience, public space, each other, our built environment in one particular way, or maybe many particular ways based on our different modes of perception, but that those modes of perception are being augmented by new technologies, including the multispectral technologies that we're trying to engage with in this project. And so this project is sort of a moment for us to reflect on not only how the city is being newly revealed, and that activities in the city are being newly revealed by these technologies, but it's also a way for us to reflect as designers on ways in which we can engage and perhaps subvert or evade that kind of perception. So revealing the new transparency, but also working with and against it as a design strategy.
Yeah, the first thing in terms of the teaching aspect, I want to first call out, my team that I worked with, and Joel Leon from WashU is joining us. And I'll just be honest, I learned maybe more from them with how to do things than, I don't know, maybe they learned something from me, I don't know. But I don't, as a designer, as a practitioner, as a teacher, I don't know how to use the milling machine, right? I'm kind of getting to that. I don't draw as much as I used to, as I should. So I think due credit that's what's so beautiful, I think, about this, what the curators have put together is that, a lot of people stepped up to make these happen, right? But saying that, for going on 10, 15 years now, I've been developing these series of mappings, these atlases of these 3 river basins that I mentioned. So it's all two-dimensional, right? And it's flat, it's orthographic, very intentionally orthographic. It's almost engineer-like in its construction. And I've always wanted to build a 3-dimensional version of it, just in the simplest sense. And then when talking with Mimi and Iker about it, I'm like, is it too literal to just kind of make it look like the watershed, right? Like the form of it, but then experiment with all these different amplifications of different invisibilities or conditions that we normally don't see. So yeah, I think that's kind of the literalness of it was kind of took, like, because it's so overwhelming when you're looking at these things that maybe it just needs kind of a matter-of-fact way of going up. And then the important thing about this type of venue is back to that idea of collaboration, and collaborating not just with your team, but with your community, Columbus, or the community of the watershed. And what does it mean for human scale? So like the vertical exaggeration, I keep getting that question, how did you come up with that exaggeration? And I'll just say it was somewhat intuitive, but more so it was, what does it mean for a person to see it at eye level or experience it? So take that, and that's what I think it's cool, is that when you can have these venues, whether it's next to a river, next to a microbrewery. I did a project on a barge where we did a panel discussion out on the Mississippi River. You provide these new platforms, literally different platforms for engagement that honestly aren't in a room like this, or in a conference hall, right? But out in the field and almost in sometimes unsettling contexts, I believe that's a way of starting to collaborate and catalyze and think about these issues that we just think are intractable, right? So it's...
Derek, I think you bring up a very interesting point, and it's probably useful to point out to the audience that the three projects have also put together short videos that you can look at that talk about more of the process and the formulation of the ideas. And one of the things that really shines in each one of the videos is this notion that Derek's talking about of collaboration. That all three groups are very careful to talk about the influence of everybody on the team for generating these solutions. So maybe we could talk a little bit further about that. The heavy collaboration of each of these projects with individuals, but also individual perspectives, also laboratories and facilities, machinery, industry partnerships in some cases. Can you talk a little bit further, each of the groups, about the productive dynamic of these conversations and how that's helped shape the work?
Sure. Well, I know where I want to start. I just happened to see Nathan Horlander back there, who spent a ton of time as part of my team, undergraduate landscape architecture student. And, you know, in terms of collaboration, I typically teach graduate students. And so on this project in particular, I had 4 fantastic undergraduate students that put in so much time on this project and just worked their butts off. And so Nathan, thanks for coming, and thanks for all of your help. Amelia, Celeste were at the opening weekend, and so I think they didn't want to come back. And Rainer helped move, so he was probably scared I was going to have him do some heavy lifting. So, from students, but also collaborating with colleagues that typically might not necessarily work with in these capacities. Dan Eisinger did a lot of coding work, but also thinking about how the CNC and the mill machines at Ball State would, cut all this acrylic out and perform. And so then thinking about how then the code then performs for the machine part of it. So we're working with the fabrication lab, the wood shop. We also have a maker space in Majax in Muncie. So collaborating with Ball State, but also community members there to make some of these pieces happening. Community members, as we get to Columbus and need help stepping in and providing things that we need just at the moment. Sisters coming in to help, just all the different colleagues that helped move everything. Josh, Kathy, Janice, calling on faculty to pick up whatever is needed. So, there's just so many different collaborations, different spaces being used, different machine. I talked about the CNC machine, milling the acrylic, wood cutting aluminum, but then also, so there's this sort of central middle of all these collaborations. But then we're also collaborating with like FarmBot out in California for their piece in it, and they're willingly letting me hack their hard work in order to make this thing do what I want it to do, and providing help at last minute, parts where it's like, okay, your software doesn't allow us to do this, and they write something and insert it for us. So, again, calibrating those middles and those centers of how things work. I don't know if that's a good answer, but there it is.
I just wanted to go back to something that Stephen said. We were talking about revealing, this act of revealing what could be, or what is not necessarily visible. And I think one of the things that moves us forward, and I know this is true of my design research, is just bringing an awareness to these things, changing the public awareness is part of moving forward. And so just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, maybe to the question about the collaborations and the way that the project grew out of multiple voices. I mean, I think we gave ourselves, if not an impossible task, at least an improbable task, that we were meant to deploy this infrared reflective material in this alley in Columbus, Indiana, while designing it from a train station in El Paso and delivering it just in time, you know, for kind of minimum effort, let's say, and maximum effect. And we had the benefit of a lot of interesting partnerships. So we co-direct a research center at Texas Tech El Paso called the Project for Operative Spatial Technologies, POST, which has an amazing fab lab and a group of amazing undergraduate research assistants who were really instrumental, especially at the prototyping phase, to get a kind of like proof of concept for assembling this really lightweight, pretty inherently flimsy material into this self-structural module that then we were able to deploy and sort of shield infrared and thermal imaging with on site. We also benefited from a kind of, I guess it's now a long-term collaboration with some fabricators in New York, Associated Fabrication, who actually cut our cut files and did a brilliant job, you know, flat packing everything and delivering it just in time to the Crump Theater. Lear Waterjet and Central Sheet Metal were really instrumental in sort of helping the piece hit the ground with some custom steel anchor fabrication of some parts we designed. Jess Schnepp and her team at Crump Theater were amazing in terms of just hands-on access to the site and support during fabrication. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of folks, but it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of being flexible when, you know, material supplies got stuck in the Suez Canal, and we had to change the design pretty significantly with not a lot of time left. You know, any design's a collaborative effort, and it takes a lot of voices. The voice of, you know, engineering consultants, the voice of just full-scale prototypes talking back to you about what they want to do versus what you thought that they could do in the computer, right? Yeah, every design process is collaborative, and this was no exception.
I suppose that's a really important lesson for students to learn, right? That being flexible and adjusting to impediments and you know, learning how to adjust things accordingly.
Yeah, picking up on the Suez Canal thing, you know, sorry, Steve and Ursula for that, but you know, back in May, when we really ramped up with getting this going, I mean, we had been designing before that, obviously, through the process, but when the fabrication started, like any of this stuff that everyone's been dealing with for the last 18, 20 months, every turn around the corner seems like some, you know, diversion or crisis moment. One, we were not approved yet to use any of the facilities at Sam Fox School WashU in the summer per COVID protocols. And we have, if anyone's been to WashU lately, we have some really nice new buildings that opened the fall before, like ridiculously nice. So sorry, there's the plug for WashU. And fabrication labs and laser cut, everything, you know? And then it's like, oh crap, we're not even gonna be able to use these, and it's still gonna be an empty building, and we're gonna have to outsource this thing. But we got the approval. And then came the funding for the students, and we mobilized and we got multiple approvals for that. So it was really great that kind of turned on the dime. But then the first thing I said, and I'll be quiet, was what can we find at Home Depot on the shelves right now, or what can we get on Amazon Prime guaranteed in 2 days? Let's not mess with the Suez Canal. And so, but we were lucky because it was like foam, right? There was a lot of foam still on shelves, and there's no lumber at that time, but there was foam. So we bought a hell of a lot of foam and milled it. Yeah.
That's good. It's cheaper than lumber.
Much cheaper, but full of chemicals.
So, yes. Just to bring it back home, I guess, this notion of the work that you're doing, you're asking significant questions. I think about, the powerful play of light on form and defining space in a multi-spectral imaging world, right? What you said at your installation piece, what happens when you can see through everything? How do we design in that kind of world, right? And so these questions that you're asking, I think, are significant questions for the future for all of these projects, and perhaps the way that you're engaging, addressing the analysis and the synthesis for tackling those questions somehow is inherently tied to this notion of collaboration and conversation and discussion, and bringing whatever team members are necessary to the conversation in order to come up with productive solutions. Do you have any thoughts about the future as we move forward, and how we can help shape that future? Because these are the maps that we're going to need to turn to define new territories. Anyone?
That's the hardest question, right?
Any water for you?
Not in that part of the country. There's a hell of a lot of water in the middle. And I think that's something to be proud of in the middle of the country, is that yes, there will be droughts. We have big agriculture challenges, big industry challenges. Those are the two main things in the Midwest. That comment about the 50% of what's built was here, right? But there's still, at the end of the day, a hell of a lot of water flowing through this middle part of the country. We may not know how to manage it right now. It's maybe polluted, but it's here. Correct me if I'm wrong 30, 50 years from now, but I think there's still going to be a lot of water coming through here, through this part of the country. And that's something we should own. I don't mean that own money-wise. I mean, and so that's the other thing. This is going to cost a hell of a lot of money.
Well, everybody tried to buy the Great Lakes, and then
right.
that defined who owned the lakes, right? And it divided cities in half.
Right,
half
exactly.
the city would own the Great Lake, the other half wouldn't.
So where's the fundamental shift in thinking about monetizing these resources or not monetizing them? I think is a fascinating design problem. But it's not necessarily a political one. It's not necessarily, it's not capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a different frame of thinking and different space and time to be occupying.
We're increasingly interested in thinking about the ways in which the built environment is consistently producing imagery for these technologies that we mentioned, infrared, thermal, sonar, etc. And by producing, by the activities and by the systems and buildings constantly sort of emitting these signals, they're producing a kind of language that until just recently has been maybe undecipherable, or decipherable only to specialists like military analysts or geospatial analysts. And so as the built environment and activities in public space are emitting these signals, they're actually producing what can be understood as signatures. I think Natalie's talking about sort of understanding signatures in the geologic scale. We're interested in sort of what are the signatures of in public space? What are the signatures of an urban environment that is then codified for some sort of intervention or some sort of planning mechanism, et cetera. And so we are interested now in pursuing this idea of what is an urbanism of signatures, right? And how do we, as designers of urban environments and designers of components of urban environments, how do we take on the design of signatures, or the obfuscation of signatures as a design agenda, right? And I think we'll only see more of this sort of moving forward. The sub-perceptual layers of the city are actually a kind of maybe previously under-considered aspect of the design of the built environment, and the ability of the built environment to communicate.
Nice.
I
keep coming back to conversations kind of at the beginning of the thinking about what this project would be. And one of those is about, how do you reveal things that are hidden that we don't normally see, or that are a little bit too great to understand or typically understood. And, so I think thinking about both, the idea of climate change and how, that are sort of places that will be essential as well as hospitable will be shifting, where water is, where water isn't. Also, again, think about that idea of the cities and how we understand them. How do we bring together sort of all of this information that is both local and global, and understand the interconnectedness of those, and how something that happens far away from us or at a scale that we can't grasp affects what is happening to us. And I know that's kind of a big thing, but I guess at the beginning we were kind of at the beginning of this pandemic stuff too, and so thinking about the Lake Itasca, being this very small place where you can walk across, draining into the Gulf of Mexico, and how the Mississippi grows and becomes this sort of enormous force of nature, and all of the connections through not just that river, but then all of the watersheds that are connected to it. So.
Very nice. A very dear friend of mine taught me once, a long time ago, that the best time to end a panel is right when it gets interesting. So I'm going to pass it to you, Anne, for final thoughts.
Well, I have to correct an error that I made. James Corner is, his firm is Field Operations. I should know that. I don't know why I said Dirt Studio, but it's just on my mind. Anyway, just wanted to correct that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your work and collaboration.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take a quick break, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then reconvene at 3:10. The bathrooms are at the back, and there's also refreshments by Luca B. Coffee, so help yourself. Great, so we'll get started now again. We have our fellows Joyce Wong from the University at Buffalo, Dorian Bybee and Jay Kim from Indiana University, Lola Shepard from University of Waterloo, apologies, and Ang Lee from Northeastern University. Thanks for being here. Moderating our session today is Britt Brewer from Indiana University. Britt's the Community Outreach Coordinator for the IU J. Irwin Miller Architecture Program. He's worked for various architecture firms, most notably the firm of Venturi, Rausch, and Scott Brown. And he is the owner of his own design firm in association with D. Dustin Posner Architects. So welcome everybody, and we're excited to have you here.
Welcome and good afternoon. Welcome back from break. As we were working on this symposium, one of the points that became apparent to us was that Exhibit Columbus has created what is really the only public showcase for university design research in the country. There are other places where university design research shows up, most notably in the American Colleges and Schools of Architecture's presentations at the American Institute of Architects conventions, but those are not public. So this one is public, so it's a very important window. In addition, because of the wonderful curatorial direction and observations that have structured things, this one spreads from Texas to Toronto. So universities all across the watershed and a little bit beyond. I was born within the watershed, 20 miles east of the Mississippi River and 72 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee. I was missing from the middle for 28 years until 2018, when I came back here to join the faculty at IU, and I lived in Portland, Oregon. My friends I had a friend call me, and he said, how are you doing there in flyover country? And I said, excuse me? I said, you're the one out there on the edge. I'm in the center of the universe. And it's been wonderful. For me, it's like coming back home. I'm the one who put myself back out there. Before I go any further, I want to say thank you to our partners, to Ball State and to Exhibit Columbus for putting this together. I want to thank our dean and the director for giving me this assignment. It's been wonderful to work with Exhibit Columbus and Surak and Janice, who have been absolutely remarkable. I could go on and sing their praises and the praises of the crew. It's been wonderful to get to know Ann Hildner and Kevin Klinger, just incredible folks, wonderful conversations we've had over the last few months. And most especially, I want to thank my most immediate partner, our assistant director, Rachel Wilkin, and ask her to stand. Our staff at the school is absolutely remarkable. She has a cartoon on her wall, which is a picture of the Republic building upended and sinking below the waves. And below it says, "Oh, Rachel's out of the office." I have a few slides. Good design and architecture always lend themselves to multiple interpretations, and there's nothing less here. I'm going to share with you my own interpretations to invite yours as we go through these conversations. So if I could ask the slide lady, please. Thank you, Jamie. Now, Joyce could be furious with me because these are all birdhouses. And she's, of course, doing bathhouses. And I think my interpretation is we've had a long relationship with birds and architecture and what we've been doing with them. But at the risk of this putting me in the doghouse, I couldn't find any bathhouses. And so it's a wonderful piece of what she's doing to me. She's talking about a different engagement with architecture, with another population. It's a wonderful, beautiful message of inclusion, a place that we should all be going. If we go to the next slide, another breadth of vision comes with Haptic B and Jay Kim and Dorian Bivey's solution. We're going all the way from the pre-Columbian First Nations to modern limestone construction, all the way into 3D metal printing with the top technologies that we've got with our partner with Cummins. We're recalling still with what I call the frozen windmills on the tower, back to the agricultural landscape that we have here. And it's a marvelous, marvelous piece. Of course, we have the Serpent Mound in Ohio, in Cahokia, up above, and the connections to the First Nations is what we are thinking about now, being grateful for the land that we do have to live on. If I go on to Ang Lee's, Ang's has so many more layers than this. With this really simple, beautiful, elegant installation, she recalls so much, all the way back to Spalding's, excuse me, I just got the name wrong. Someone help me. Trish Gilson, where is she when I need her? Sparrow. I always get his name wrong. Charles Sparrow, our first noted architect here in town, and one of his houses on the left. The shingles on the side, the same as the shingles on hers. And of course, Caesar Pelle's buildings at the bottom, all the way back to LA. And of course, the iterations in town, the ceramic frit coatings on Kevin Roche's Urban Bank and Trust building. And of course, our own Republic building. Just so much to look at in a very simple installation. And finally, Ms. Shepard and Mr. White have connected us to our own companies in another way. The companies that you wonder where Arvin or where Costco might have been today if if Ms. Shepard and Mr. White had been around with us. I grew up with a Costco stool in my kitchen. I don't know if you did. I had no idea where it came from. I remember it was a beautiful green and white, and I wonder where it is today, because I know it's probably still just as good. With this, I'd like to say that I have a few questions for you today. Really just two basic ones to build on what the previous panel was talking about. One is a question about design research. We all know the scientific method. We know scientific research. And as architects and designers, we do research, technical scientific research on building materials and those things. Design research is a phrase we say a lot, but I think we have to wonder exactly what it means. And I appreciated the allusions to definitions that the previous panel members gave. But I'd like to hear from each of our panelists now, their thoughts on that. I'll be asking them also to talk about something that will help us. With this new showcase that we've now realized what we have, we're going to be doing this again and again. And in that sense, these installations and these thoughts will live for a long time. And they're speaking to that future. And so I'd like to hear a little bit from each panelist about what questions you haven't been asked that you might have wanted to talk about. And as you do answer these, certainly we want to hear more about the in-depth conversations we heard from the other panelists about your partners. That you work with both technical partners and cultural partners, and how it relates to your teaching, how it relates to your practice. And let's start and just go one by one, if you would, please, on design research and your thoughts on that definition. Ms. Lee, you want to start?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. I think I've always struggled with the term research, having like a background in architecture and being a designer. I always think of architects as being generalists, and that we have broad kind of, sort of we're interested in broad areas of topics, and this idea of expertise is something I've always kind of struggled with. And so I think when it comes to design research, like a lot of my work is interested in rethinking what material research means for architects beyond fabrication projects and beyond this idea of what can building materials do for us in terms of formal and structural explorations, and instead about what materials have to say about the sites of their production, about the labor histories behind them, about our cultural associations with them. And so I think I'm sort of interested in almost kind of treating research as an open-ended kind of exploration, maybe sometimes borrowing research methodologies from other fields, like the way that historians do archival research, or the way that anthropologists do field work, and to think about how we might be kind of taking leaps from kind of these methods into our own practices.
Thank you. That's fine.
Yeah, well, thank you first for this amazing introduction to all of us. It's really great to see the slides. So design research is certainly something that we think about a lot in universities, especially in a system, in the kind of academic system where research is seen not just only as kind of like scientific process science on the one end, but also humanities on the other end, like publishing books and things like that. So in line with this theme, I actually do think that design research is in the middle. It's something that it's on the one hand you are trying to produce new knowledge, you're trying to kind of produce knowledge within the discipline that kind of adds to the discipline and innovate. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily and there are kind of tangible outputs, but it's not something where we are necessarily trying to always solve a problem or always trying to be cited over and over again, although of course that helps, but trying to kind of work within this kind of more fuzzy territory. So I guess that's just my sort of general outlook on design research. Perhaps I'm not necessarily talking about my own work right now, but I think I'm just thinking about it more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think picking up on both of your comments, I think of design research as almost opening up new questions. I don't know how often any of us that supposedly do design research end up with, new fields of knowledge or new, clear answers. But I think in many cases, it opens up new questions or new ways to look at something, whether it's thinking about new drawing types or new research methods. And I think sometimes it's also borrowing from other disciplines of a design sense. So, how does one take an anthropological method, for instance, but then leverage it or translate it through the way an architect might. So it might be spatializing the outcomes of an interview rather than transcribing them or writing it up as a kind of text-based thing. Or it's taking GIS data or numerical data and then spatializing it. So I think sometimes our design research might be new translations of research done by others, and sometimes it's simply opening up questions within the discipline that previously haven't been looked at. I mean, I think of Ursula Stevens or Joyce's. I mean, these are just questions that no one was asking 5-10 years ago. So.
Yeah, one thing I think is fascinating about design research as kind of explicitly different from other forms of research is typically we think of research as being a process that's meant to solve a problem. What's great about design research is we kind of get to maybe provoke a problem or create problems, which really opens up a lot of interesting opportunities and gives us these avenues of exploration, which is something I think we've been very interested in pursuing for a long time now.
So our research is we are highly specific about the materiality, and then our research actually also deeply dive into the material culture, and we learn a lot of research through the history, the legacy, and then we also not just about trying to do the innovative technology for the future. We also look at the back and the history of how people really treated the material and really also learn from that. I think it's part of also our research, really learning back from the old to new or the middle to the new. We actually trying to connect the traces from what's happening before and then to the middle and then to the future. So where the research is not just looking at the front of it, we also look back of it, things like that.
Well, y'all remind me of the words of one of my professors in school, Bill Gwynn at Auburn, who said, be no more particular than necessary, be open to the possibilities. And I think that's what I've just heard 5 wonderful answers to. So that's some wonderful thought. I think the fact that the showcase does open us up to the future, and that if we can continue this with showcasing research by additional faculty members and other schools and yours as well, because of course now you're all family. You've come to Columbus. Once you've been here, now you're hooked. So it's wonderful to have you here. I think the other question that I had, which opens that too, is what are the questions? This is sort of your last chance to talk in the venues of Exhibit Columbus, with the exception of the fact that obviously you know that videos that go to the internet stay there forever, as long as we have an internet. So that's absolutely wonderful. I think that the interviews on Archinect is a wonderful opportunity, and the videos you've made have been wonderful. But I'm assuming within this process, there certainly are questions you really haven't been asked that you might want to address and talk to. And that would be interesting to hear from each of you. Ms. Lee, you want to start?
Do I always have to start?
You can start the other end. You can start this end.
We never really had a chance to really deeply talk about the communications or the conversation that we involved in the beginning of the early design stages with the indigenous people, and then how we discussed about this urgency of the visibility of the public art or public memorials for the city. And when we were starting to talk about it, we were concerned about, of course, this is kind of sensitive issues. But when we wanted to hear from their perception of how they think about it, especially in terms of how they are almost not visible in that public realm of the civic area, and they were all part of like very supportive of that. They were like deeply empathetic and deeply appreciative of this this chance to reveal and bring back to other public's eyes about where they were and how they were forgotten or almost erased. And things were I wanted to point that out. We had a good involvement with those people, which including people of Miami and Miami University, who were talking about how they were almost forgotten languages. You know, they were not really able to speak because of all the times they were separated between the boarding schools. Of course, Canada was one of the issues, things like that. So they wanted to really be part of this, all the like, you know, future projection of the public eyes to the general public.
Well, that's an important conversation to bring to the forefront. If you look at, for example, the histories of landscape architecture, either worldwide or in this country, what's striking about them is there is no mention in most of them. Now, I haven't read all of them, so I'm certainly I'm in error. There are probably some that mention, but there is not much mention of these cultures. And so I think it's an important voice to come out. Having worked with, and my clients in Oregon were the Warm Springs Confederation was one of the tribes I worked with, and the insights were just very rich and important, and so it's very good that these conversations are coming out. And Dorian, for you?
Didn't you just give the answer for me?
I'm hoping you're going to come up with one more part of this that you haven't.
You'll be disappointed. No, that was really interesting. As we were building the project, we just were really fortunate and really pleased to have so many people from the community come speak to us, engage with us. That was a question that surprisingly did not really come up. It's somewhat central to the project, and it seems like it's relatively superficially obvious. And I think the question we got asked the most was probably, where's the water? Because between it being so like water in the middle, and just apparently it looks like it's a fountain. Does anybody else, if you've seen it, do you think it looks like a fountain? I'm not sure. But that question didn't really come up, and it was something that would have been really interesting to have dialogue with the public about, particularly since this is, in our presentations we've showed examples of civic memorials, which, you know, typically in terms of the material they use, often use the same materials we're using, limestone, Indiana limestone. And they depict an entire different history or a different version of history than what is actually real. We've kind of prioritized certain versions that show what we want to. And so our project tries to depict a little bit of the complexity that's inherent in those mixed histories while still trying to be respectful of those voices that don't usually get heard.
Well, along the limestone, y'all can probably see it from here. Dorian and I were separated by a piece of stone, just a very thin one, 2 inches, because in 1987, when I was working in Philadelphia for Bob and Denise, I was working in the Seattle Art Museum, and Bob had a fit because we had a cost-cutting exercise that made this stone thinner, but luckily we came up with a great stone cutter who carved the stone for the project, and a man named William Bybee, the father of this gentleman here, ended up being the company that made that stone. We've talked about it since, and about his worry about transporting the stone over the country and worried that it might break. And it actually upped the cost of shipping because we had to reinforce the stone a bit more. On the site, another piece, because Bybee's, and if you have not been to Bybee Stone and taken the tour, I would say go see it. You even have on the horizontal pieces a sort of a representation of something I think is, Bybee's the only one who still has this cutting technique. Could you describe that to us?
I think you're referring to Shatsan, which is about as primitive a technology as you can imagine. And that was another thing we actually tried to incorporate. If you look at the way we use materials, we tried to use tools that were extremely primitive and tools that were cutting edge. because that does provide sort of a dialogue between, I mean, the way we fabricate things tells us a lot about who we are as people, as cultures. So yeah, in that particular case, the Shatsan is about 150-year-old technology. And yet it's absolutely gorgeous, though, I think. I think most people really enjoy it.
You actually put metal shot in with the saws, and a large block is passed through these reciprocating saws, and the shot is aggregate that's rubbing, scraping on these and gouging the sides and giving a texture to those sides. Now after that, you gave them their flatbed CNC, right? Which is what you carved your frozen windmills with.
Yes, frozen windmills, or yeah, the things being held up by the spiders from Mars. I think you've also referred to.
I've dubbed them the spiders from Mars.
We need to just rely on you for captions for all of our material, because that's going to be the. What's interesting when you talk about the Shatsan process, it reminds us a little bit of glaciation, actually, why Columbus, the landscape of Columbus actually exists as it is, and the process that created the new middles that we've been talking about, the watershed, and that kind of process actually of stones being passed across the landscape by ice. Yeah, so that's actually an interesting way of describing it.
I mean, I don't know if it's that I haven't been asked, but I've been thinking about how the piece we did here, which does tie into a series of public art installations that we've done that are very much about public engagement and sort of participation. And I was thinking sort of, well, how does this tie into a lot of our other, perhaps more, what one might think of more as sort of design research, which is looked at, architecture's relationship to environment in contexts like the far north, or working with Indigenous partners across Canada. And I realized that, I think the link is always the interest in the user as the kind of activator of the environment. So whether it is the domestic environment of a house in northern Canada, or whether it is the public space here in Columbus. And so I think for us, I guess it's not so much we haven't been asked this, but I think what's been interesting, sort of seeing the piece and thinking about all the pieces is how, how this ties into a kind of larger body of work that is seemingly very disparate, but one starts to realize there's sort of threads that tie things, even if some are geopolitical and some are, seemingly playful and, more lighthearted, but this question of how people sort of transform and appropriate space. And that I was reading a piece by a French author, Georges Perec, the other day, who writes this. He has this wonderful book called Species of Spaces, and he talks about everything from the room to the house to the city to the neighborhood. And when he's talking about the house, he says, what makes your house a home? Is it when you've hung 3 socks up? Is it when you've made tea in it? And I think one could ask the same about public space. When is public space your own? Is it when someone uses it voluntarily? Is it when children are playing? Is it when it's empty? So I think, this question of the user and how that ties through is
you sort of had that verified today in our visit.
Yes.
Right? And tell us what you saw when. I mean, you had the whole world of Disney march across the street.
Actually, I should have stayed a few minutes longer. I think I watched the procession before they actually hit the installation. But yeah, I mean, I think for us, and that was a very deliberate decision for the piece here, was that we wanted to make something where the public was not only looking, but needed to interact for them to make sense of the design speculations, I guess we'll call it. I don't know if this is design research, but I think it is design speculation. And so it's validating when, maybe it's like a post-occupancy evaluation. When, if someone is using it as you hope, or even if they're using it not as you hope, in fact, just use is I'll take that, even if it's misuse.
Well, we even had a lime green Pomeranian that that was running around with the children in between.
Oh, I missed. Oh God, I hope it's not that photo.
I've never seen a lime green Pomeranian.
It's like 7. They're going on my Instagram.
But it was like the children were running through, and it was sort of exactly what you described, what you hoped, and playing hide and seek from their parents.
And that I mean, that's one thing that also has been a tie-in from more recent design research work, which is really trying to ground design through community engagement. So in this case, we worked with these 6th graders from Lincoln Elementary, and started to kind of let them actually imagine games that they could play in the space, and so when to then see people not necessarily play the exact games that the students had developed, but validate the fact that that there is this kind of interest in public space. And kids are, of course, there's no one better because there's no self-consciousness. They're willing to kind of use public space to play, to lie, to roll in ways that as adults we sort of subdue, impetuses, I'm not sure, to kind of engage in public space. So it's
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
I think one of the things that I would have liked to talk about more, or would like to have been asked about, is the kind of relationship between Columbus and my home city, or where I live now, and what kinds of, say, parallels or differences or exchanges I could imagine between Columbus and Buffalo. I taught a studio at University of Buffalo, and while I was starting to design the project, before we started fabrication, I was also teaching a studio, and a lot of the work that I was kind of, the research for this project was also something that we were exploring in the studio as well. Also, as I know many of you know, there's one of my colleagues, Greg Delaney, taught a course, and he gives a lecture where he basically talks about Columbus as basically picking up where Buffalo left off in terms of architecture. So the last kind of significant building in the 20th century in Buffalo was by the Saranins, in 1938, 1940, which is the Kleinhans Music Hall, and then, of course, like First Christian Church, I think, was 1942. Or anyway, so there was almost a very direct move of the Saranins from Buffalo to Columbus, and there's actually this idea of like basically living and teaching and experimenting in a city with an incredible architectural legacy. I think has an incredible attention to craftsmanship, design, kind of experiencing cities and so on. I think that has a lot to that there's a lot of parallels that I see there between cities, and also, which is I think why I see Columbus as my second home now.
Well, there are a lot of connections, I think, and in your work on the bats alone. And I meant what I said about the inclusion piece, because I think what we know now about animals living in the city and about birds adapting to urban life. And I think you mentioned last night when we were discussing trying to solve the problem of buildings that kill birds. And unfortunately we're sitting in one, because of it. You can walk around the building on any given week, and it's a little bit sad. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but it is something we should be thinking about. There was a recent, I think it was a NOVA program on bats that was probably pretty timely, particularly given the pandemic and all of the discussion about where that's arisen. And then here you come in and encouraging us to put bat houses in our yards. Not literally, but we're working on them. I think what it means to me is that there's a lot of depth to some of these issues that are not readily apparent. And so my question to you is, my assumption is your design can draw out and help discuss those issues. And that's a good purpose for design research, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, and as I was mentioning before, in places where there is attention, where there is kind of public civic attention to design, issues like this are not just kind of like, or at least shouldn't be just brushed under the table. It's not like, oh, here's a problem to solve, we're going to, figure out a way to kind of, deal with urban wildlife as pests or and so on, but to really kind of include thinking of different subjectivities, subjectivities that we don't normally kind of think of as our, as our publics within our as subjects within our design. So and not just as like not just thinking like, oh, how do we, again, like not how do we just solve this problem, but how do we actually really embody them.
So maybe we shouldn't be building walls to keep out pests, but fences to make good neighbors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, not to get political about it.
Right.
Well, Ms. Lee, you were first.
Sure. I mean, I think I keep thinking back to a couple of things that Mimi and Ika were talking about at the beginning of this discussion about how so many of these projects have a kind of very site-specific component that's specific to Columbus, and then they have this more universal component that relates it back to other things that we've been thinking about or looking at. And I think that's something that I keep going back to in the project that we had the opportunity to work on here, which is that there's a part of the project that relates to a really site-specific history of the commons and the Gruen building that used to be on the site. But there's also a kind of deeper sort of material history that relates it to, I think, a much more universal form of material memory and some things I've been looking at in other projects that I've worked on over the last few years. So about a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to spend 6 weeks at a construction and demolition waste recycling center where I started doing a little bit of field work and a little bit of design work around looking at the afterlives of 20th century miracle materials. A lot of materials like mylar that's used in this installation and things like EPS foam that really shaped our understanding of kind of buildings and enclosures and interior comfort kind of throughout the 20th century. And these were highly engineered materials that were often developed as a part of the aerospace industry or as sort of for military use that were later adapted for commercial applications that we then came to have all these associations with, but ones that also, that we don't normally think of as building materials, but ones that actually are used extensively in buildings as insulation, as window film, as kind of cladding materials that are often kind of in the background. And so I guess maybe the one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is just, a lot of the project was also interested in thinking about how we give visibility, like building on this theme of making things visible to these materials that have shaped so much of our understanding of modern architecture, but that we don't normally kind of perceive or to give it weight in some ways. And so, some of that is also about going back to this question of not solving problems, but asking new questions. Some of it is also interested in thinking about material reuse through a different lens, where instead of focusing on thinking about the remedial or kind of metrics, of shifting to kind of thinking about optics, of how could working with reclaimed materials or recycled materials or embracing the sort of workflows of the waste processing industry lead to different types of aesthetic sensibilities or different value systems for architecture. And so I think the most valuable thing that I got out of this whole process was really all the conversations that we had with the different fabricators and the different material consultants who we spoke to really at the beginning of the project, of the fabrication phase of the project at least, and not just at the end. And this includes the way that we source the material, where we worked with a recycling center in Philly to get all of this mylar that is basically byproducts from the food product packaging industry. And then we ended up speaking to a lot of adhesive specialists, vinyl installers, car wrappers. We worked with a great vinyl installer here in Columbus called Path Signs. And so I think for us, the installation really wasn't the kind of end product or sort of prototype for the research, but the process of making it is the research or the field work, where we were really exposed to all of these different forms of expertise for like maintaining the architectural surface or creating an architecture of surface and effects. That wasn't something that I was an expert in by any means before. And so I think that process, that learning process, is something that I'd love to foreground more in the project. And so that's some of what we talk about in the videos too.
Well, it's part of a wonderful continuum of that technological growth. I mean, to bore them with architectural history, curtain walls, you can trace them back to a chocolate factory in Belgium, and we know. And where the wall is not the bearing wall, it's the wall that's on the surface This wall here is actually a framed wall because each mullion is on a building post. And if you go back to aluminum, the aluminum curtain wall, the first one was in Portland, Oregon, built in 1949, the Commonwealth building by Pietro Beluschi. And of course, that was a contract that he got from Kaiser. Kaiser, who had come out there to build Liberty ships, he was a paving contractor from Ohio, and taking advantage of the war effort. But during the war, and paying attention to the aluminum production that was going on for Boeing, which was being powered by the hydroelectric plant for the Bonneville Power Administration, which was put in by the Eisenhowers during the Depression. And he went to Pietro and says, the war's ending, I've still got to make aluminum and make money. What are we going to do? And so they did it. So everything from the aluminum curtain wall to the aluminum light fixtures and the first use of fluorescence and the first application of the heat pump ever in the history of the world, which was developed in the 18th century, first put into work there. And all of this is part of a continuum. And with that, to conclude our conversation, I think that you see that all of these fellows here are positioned within this continuum of history. They're not ending anything. They're beginning questions that will continue with their own work and with the showcases that we have coming up. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much. This has been a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you guys so much. That was wonderful. We have one final conversation today, our concluding conversation. And when our committee was thinking about how we wanted to develop this program, I think we were excited about the idea of inviting some special guests to be in conversation with our curators about some observations that they have about Exhibit Columbus, about the work that's been created, about the curatorial theme and just being in this city, and sort of what we're all making together. And so we're really excited to have two fantastic speakers today in conversation with our curators, Minnie Zeiger and Iker Gill. The first, I'd like to invite Amale Andraos up to the stage. Amale is the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. She's committed to design research, and her writings have focused on climate change and its impact on architecture, as well as on the question of representation in the age of global practice. Andraos is co-founder of Work AC, a New York-based firm that focuses on architectural projects that reinvent the relationship between urban and natural environments. In addition to Work AC, was recently named the #1 design firm in the US by Architect magazine. So welcome them all to our city and to the stage.
Thank you. Maybe since I'm alone, I'll stand and then I'll sit when I'm joined. It's really been a wonderful day and a half. I've always wanted actually to come here. I heard a lot about Columbus, and when I first kind of heard the title as being born in another middle, that of the Middle East, I've always wondered whose middle is it anyway? Who defines, what is an edge, what is a middle, and so I think today it was very clear that in visiting the different installations and being in the city, it's really about ways of seeing, different ways of seeing, as Laura Kurgan, the professor at CHISA, kind of always engages with. Mimi said, making the invisible visible, recasting boundaries, geographies, histories. There was a real sense of displacing control, addressing power systems, of course, decentering, decolonizing, recasting, reshaping. I think all of the projects really successfully dealt with many of these questions through design. In particular, the question of scale. At what scale do we engage issues today? Was really fantastic, and I thought it's so interesting. I mean, we've known for some time that landscape has displaced architecture, in the ways of kind of thinking about this time we live in, because of its capacity to zoom in, zoom out, to really think
think not so much through systems, through objects, but through systems and infrastructures. And I think that it's also really interesting, to kind of think through this moment. I think, I was thinking about the projects in relation with the history of Columbus and its history of engaging with modernism, right? And so this legacy of modernity here in the city, and how, for example, Derek Hoffman's project, questions these technology as it was born with modernity. And there was this really interesting article this morning in the New York Times on cooling the planet, and the fact that it's not going to be enough to decarbonize, right? We have to supposedly geoengineer and send sulfur in the atmosphere. All these technologies. Here we go again, right? Here we go again, kind of developing new technologies to kind of remedy the technologies that we developed. And so it's such a moment, to think through these questions here. Where the kind of history of modernity through architecture is so visible is really very interesting. And to think through, I think Joyce's work about designing for other species is, I think that, rather than inventing new technologies, rather opening up new spaces for us to think about building shelter and habitat, especially that we discovered that shelter is no longer shelter, right? Because you see through everything now. And so if buildings are no longer a way to be protected, then what are they doing? And I think that, I love the Spectral project, for these questions. And I think one of the interesting aspects or scary aspects of COVID is that being inside became dangerous, right? So completely inverting, again, the relationship between architecture and landscape, which I think we've seen through the projects, today. And so is this disappearance an opportunity? I think that was Lola's question. And I think it is. Everything is so overexposed right now, polarized, fragmented, sort of isolated, networked. But there is a sense of place, and maybe it's in the gaps, right? Where you build a new middle, a new ground, maybe to come together. I think this is really kind of crucial, and I love that this could be done through play, and that the kids were there to reclaim the possibility of the middle, because after all, the middle is, as architects, what certainly I dreamt of designing for. And, I'm not designing for the elite, and not believing that I'm not sure I can address the most vulnerable people, as we say, through design. I worry about patronizing, reducing, and the middle. And so if the middle disappears, and the middle class, then what do we do as architects? I think all of the projects ask this, and reclaiming a possibility for a middle is really interesting. Because the history that, yesterday I took a kind of architectural tour, it was about designing for this middle. It was this kind of aspiration. Can we as architects think of new forms of education, new schools, new fire stations, and that ambition, I think, is very clear through that history, and I think something that we can consider again. And so, I guess and of course this kind of revealing is not just geographic or spatial, but as it was said, it's also historical in terms of time and the notion of archival revival, as Lake Dreyfus's project kind of stages, and I think the performance really brought that to life, is so crucial to think through our histories and their complexities and what we borrowed to make modernism to be modern, and kind of returning some of that is absolutely crucial, whether it's African peoples or indigenous people, and I think this is a really interesting moment. So I guess my kind of zooming out a little bit from this particular middle and this tension between the embodiment of modernity and architecture that we see in many of the buildings in this building with the questions that we're asking today so poignantly about the foundation of that modernity and kind of trying to undo much of its kind of notions of universalism, of progress, of the legacy of colonialism, of occupation, all of that is a result of modernity. But at the same time, can we hold together the aspirations that some of the buildings that I visited yesterday kind of were trying to achieve, right? The sense that we should provide education for all. We should be thinking differently about kind of housing, etc. There was an aspiration that I think is still interesting for us as architects to think through. And I think Columbus seems to be holding these two tensions together. As was said in this last panel, there's discontinuity, but there's also continuity. And so I think that the projects ask, where should we continue, and where should we really discontinue to find a new space? And I thought that was quite poignant. So thank you.
Totally put you on the spot. I'm sorry about that. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Shannon, I'm going to have you come up and join them all, and then maybe Aoife, you can come up too. I'll let you just go through some of your work, and then we'll have a conversation. Does that sound good? Perfect. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Welcome. Come on up. Come on up. So Shannon Nichol is the founding principal of GGN. Shannon's designs, including Millennium Park's Glory Gardens, the Belinda Gates Foundation campus, and Boston's North End Parks, are widely recognized for being deeply embedded in their neighborhoods and locally native ecologies. Shannon is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects, Seattle. Welcome.
I'm going to run my own slides so that this doesn't take a lot longer than it needs to. Thank you so much, invading your workspace. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to be here and around this beautiful work. I've had such an inspiring day. The main thing that I've taken away from reading the narratives and the background on these projects, and also having the privilege of spending some time in Columbus working on the Air Park project, is that where we are at this point in time as a design community and a global community is at a point in time where we need to think about the things we don't design. And as designers, a lot of us, and my firm, we founded the firm in the heart of the Starkitecture era. And so a lot of us know at this point that we're pretty good at controlling things as designers, meticulously controlling detail, materials, nature. And then if we broaden that out to Western and colonized history and landscape, controlling entire watersheds, controlling ecologies, controlling and suppressing cultures, ancient cultures. So it's kind of a funny thing though, because by one definition and tradition, our job as designers is to control things. It's to find a way to organize and define. And I love solving those puzzles myself. So this is a really impactful conversation. The University Design Research Fellowships here, the Mapping the Middle dialogue, it's impactful for private practice. So that's what I sort of see my lens coming in. How does this relate to and impact what we do as a private design practice? I will change the slide. I did want to briefly mention, I had the most humbling experience at our firm. We did installation at the 2008 Venice Architecture Biennale, and that was so humbling and difficult. And that was probably like the one time we almost broke up as a firm because it was so difficult finding funding, trying to do all this stuff. So I have so much respect for what you all have done and cobbled together. Okay, so on that note, just a little bit of background on control and private practice. This is some of our work that we might be most well known for. Mostly, I'm going to show you our early work from the 2000s. The Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery with Foster and Partners, and our job was there, the ground plane, and thinking about how to control and manipulate things in different ways. We still love to do that as an office, detailing. And my role, working with architecture and design, is often thinking through what are the different ways we can position and manipulate people's perceptions of things. And also, how does a building and how does the human experience fit in the landscape? This is the same project, just saying, is it this or that? That's my job. Up until recent years, that results in something like this. That's a set of hard materials, and it's a defined design that we hope is going to last as it is for a long time. But there's been this other vein. Early for me, it was the first big design competition I did, the Lurie Garden, with Pete Rudolph designing the plantings. It started this observation that our work as designers can be a framework for local conversations about where they are. This was supposed to be this world-class, it was actually the exact words, world-class botanical garden with rare and unusual plants. Our interpretation of that was, what if we went to the one person we know about that's doing work with Midwestern native plants, who happens to be in Holland, Pete Rudolph at the time, and we brought Chicago's own locally native plants into Millennium Park with all this world-class sculpture and said, this is world-class planting. And luckily, Pete knows how to do that, and the Lurie family stepped up and endowed the management of the garden. For me, that made me realize all the other places I work that aren't Chicago are way behind on understanding local place. And the work that I do in design, maybe the most significant legacy I leave, is creating a framework for repair and creating a framework for the things I'm not designing, which are animals, plants, insects, and indigenous truth. So I started teaching myself about things I couldn't find in landscape architecture books and didn't have in my education, which is when I put a plant in the ground, which insects may be dependent upon that plant in order to reproduce. And at home, I started to, with my son, plant from seed, because they're not available in nurseries, locally native plants to my region that are sun and urban tolerant, which aren't in nurseries, as I mentioned. And then just from our yard and doing these projects, we started to see what insects are associated with those plants. That has been like this re-education for me in the middle of my life. And I've gotten into studying these insects. This is the great golden digger wasp. You have them here too. They're transcontinental insects. And they tend to be attracted to weedy plants that landscape architects don't want to include because you can't control them. They spread. So that's launched an entirely different sort of mode of my career and how we at GGN plant. We purposely now plant colonizing plants that we can't control. They spread, they heal the soil. It's a very different way of gardening that's more about reforestation and letting nature take its course. And this is one of our early examples of this from 5 or 6 years ago at the Gates Foundation, a seeded urban habitat meadow that's really expressly to heal the soil and bring insects in. And then other things that we can't see, and designing for people's daily lives as opposed to thinking about what the big form of something is. And this was a design competition in San Francisco, India Basin Shoreline Park, that I'm still shocked that we won, because waterfront park design competitions tend to be really showy affairs, as a lot of us know. And this was our proposal, which was connect the public housing up the hill across this horrible road with no safe crossings, connect them to the waterfront that's already there, which was an already interesting worn down industrial place, with this series of walkways and piers that just provides access and makes their neighborhood more healthy. So how does this relate to what we saw today? I think it was so striking, even looking at the installations online, that they're all about engaging with and capturing ephemeral aspects of our environment. And that does relate to, or result in striking forms. But the willingness to reckon with and start with this sort of reception of what's already there and making it visible, reacting to it, that's where we're all needing to go as a design community, a global community. So thinking about the design process as a framework for dialogue and for learning together, even before you get to an end product, our job as designers are to facilitate conversations. We've been enjoying doing that with the Air Park project, facilitating conversations about what is Columbus, what is this place. And a lot of these installations included dialogue as part of their design process. Sorry, I'm going to skip that. Thinking about the amount of inclusion and dialogue that these projects have generated, it just makes me really excited about where we're all going. And this is an example of one of the projects where I learned a lot. The Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle. This is a place where it's a place for dialogue between our indigenous neighbors in the Pacific Northwest and all the rest of us who need to learn from them. So Olson Kundig was the architect, and this is a camas meadow there in the foreground. And the purpose of it is to be a place where people can interact with other people and learn from each other and learn from the landscape. And my worldview about native plants was changed, working with the Council of Tribal Elders. Understanding these ancient agreements that are in every native plant that we work with, that I will never understand in my lifetime, but an equal exchange of power and help. 15,000 camas plants, which is a sacred edible food, and there it is in its first year coming up, and it's a place where the food will be harvested and tribal youth will learn from their elders. So every one of these pieces has something that it's engaging with that is not just about the hard materials of the piece. And I was just going to close on some other examples of our work that's very different from the work I showed you at the beginning, where we're really interested in just setting up this framework of pieces, ideally pieces that could even be thinking, when the life cycle of the project's done, are the pieces modular enough that they can be easily moved and reused for something else? Or if the site gets developed in some other way, can it be disassembled in a way that's low resource? But in the meantime, we want things to take over, and we don't want it to appear controlled or for it to be controlled. So these are all native plants. It's a project in Seattle. And it's actually a pretty fancy house by Castana's architects that it's next to. Brought in old growth stumps that we disassembled and reassembled on site to remind people of this truth of the landscape there that's been forgotten and the scale of it. And here you have this deep truth that's monumental about humankind and landscape and how to live here that we're just starting to scratch the surface and learn from. So it's a privilege to be working on a project in Columbus in the landscape and to start to try to humbly understand the footprints that we're in. And I'm just gonna close with a little plug for Air Park. You can see it outlined in pink there on the north. So it's part of this confluence here in Columbus of people, culture, rivers, and thinking. But it's also about really making education accessible to a much more diverse sector of our community than what is typical. And I thought this was an interesting stat. Today, 1 in 7 residents of Columbus are born outside of the US. And the role that manufacturing has in that. So 3 different educational institutions on this site that's been wiped clean in our modern times, as much of Indiana has. This is what the campus looks like now. Our work to vision is to move beyond that. But the great truth of this entire place is that it's a forest. And that's really true for all of Indiana, which blew our coastal minds, understanding that nearly 90% of Indiana was covered with forest in the early 19th century. But by 1900, it was reduced to 4% of what it was. A lot of us think of Indiana as flat, open cornfield. Well, maybe it was prairie before, because that's the most we can imagine. It's very different. So we don't know where we're going with Air Park exactly yet, which is a good thing. We're still in dialogue with the community, but the more we learn, the more we realize it's going to be a definitive project, because it's in Columbus and informed by dialogues like this, a definitive project for our next way of needing to design as frameworks open to change and growth, as opposed to being defined by built form and static design. Thank you.
The switchover is complete. Thanks for the patience on that. Thank you both for such beautiful presentations and reflections on this work. I have to say, as a curator, it's quite an honor to have someone sort of take the time and really dig into the work and say it back to you. So I'm grateful for that. Ika and I have questions. We're not super organized in our questioning here, so this may take a little bit of some turns, so bear with us. I really want to start with this question that Amale, you started with the question of scale. Maybe because we are at that level of the flyover, and I think in both of your practices, there's, and clearly in this work, there's this idea of the local, of the localized project, of the materiality of that project, of of the species and the habitat. And then there are the scales that are infrastructural, that are planetary, that are kind of coming at us not as a community dialogue, but are coming at us as a kind of climate emergency. And I think that's a lot for anyone, any designer to hold in their head. I think Timothy Morton is one who calls them hyper-objects as this way to kind of conceptualize the big. But I think it's not only just kind of the big, but it's that perhaps middle ground between the two. And I just want to open up to you both to sort of reflect a little bit on that tension in there.
Yeah, I think that's why we need the middle desperately, because it's a moment. Like we should not think of the middle as obviously a boundary, or this is my frame. I don't care for what happens outside of it. Which has been a lot the issue with the building, right? I mean, even if we think about I don't know, sustainable checklist, right? Like somehow the frame of the building is what you're supposed to be. The envelope, the famous envelope. Yeah, but the envelope, things come in, come out. How do you measure energy? You know, the envelope is perforated. Nevertheless, I think it is still useful. And one of the kind of images that I love to think about and that I have shared with my students when they feel overwhelmed, because it is such an overwhelming moment right now to practice, to teach, that is, think about a plate of food that is well designed. Every single kind of color, every single ingredient that's on your plate is coming from somewhere, so somebody grew it, but at the same time it is composed and it is nutritious and it is, so I think to think about holding things together and for a moment framing them at a scale that is, that we can handle, and knowing that it's a temporary moment and never imagining that you've solved it at the level of your plate. I think that's why the middle is so crucial. Yeah.
I think that the majority of places that I work and travel to are flyover places mentally and in the system right now, which is, I think, pretty impactful to things like climate and other issues. And when I say flyover, I mean the scale and speed of the thinking, how we get materials, how difficult it is to source locally made materials because it's so cheap right now with the way our system's set up to zoom things all over the world and ship things, and how fast we're expected to design and how remotely. So there's something about that kind of dialogue around scale that's a real problem we all need to reckon with. And digging in to each place, each piece of dirt that we're working on is really important to solve climate change. I think if we just start digging in and trying to inconvenience ourselves a little more and invest in that, we can solve it piece by piece. But it's not as exciting. And I do see landscape architects coming out of schools knowing how to map watersheds, no offense. They know how to map watersheds and do incredible, big scale analyses, but they don't know how to dig in. They haven't had that mental practice of doing the iterative work, the local work. So we all have to work on that.
Sure. So one thing that was interesting, I think Amale said also, ways of seeing. One of the things that was interesting from the University Design Research Fellows is, they are all from sometimes closer to Columbus, but sometimes farther, and they had different ways of seeing what Columbus is. There's this legacy of modernism, but they brought in their own research, their own way of understanding a place, and then they found ways to reveal that, whether it was, sometimes we have the drawings, but sometimes we have the models, or we have a machine, or we have an object. I'm kind of very curious in your professional practice and academia and the way you relate to people about how you foster or embrace this idea of ways of seeing places maybe in unique ways, but also what are the ways that you've seen that people can reveal those findings, and maybe what are the challenges that we have as how we communicate that to clients, but also public or students, and what are possibilities there?
I think what's interesting and cuts across many of the projects is, so in this tension, right, between the specific and the universal, between the local and the global, and this kind of, I think for me, this questioning of, intense questioning of modernity again, and it's not postmodern, it's something else, right? We're questioning it differently. I think it's interesting how much landscape is a kind of new universal, or ecology, or the projects kind of gravitated towards this kind of systems. where anywhere you land, you can think through these systems in a way maybe it's more accessible today somehow to be a kind of common language than is built form or architecture, and which has lost some of its, unfortunately, capacity to trigger a shared experience somehow. That was my sense today. Is many of the projects enlisted ideas about landscape or ecology or systems or ground or sedimentation or territory or as a way to communicate, as opposed to digging into the more architectural culture somehow.
Landscape's really weirdly hard to see. So one of the most challenging parts of my job is to help my clients and communities and myself see the land as something that's the product of a series of choices people have made, optional choices, and that we can change it again. I don't know if it's an instinct where we're wired to think that it's like geologically formed and permanent because we're not used to having so much impact on the landscape as humans, but it's really hard to see the landscape as something that is on the table, and to get community members to see the way a road is configured as something that they can change and make better. So we use drawings a lot, so we'll like peel the buildings off and say this is topography, there's buildings on it, you can see it is land. Or we'll show historic images of what it used to look like, what it is now. It was not always like this. If it was different before, you can change it again. But it's important to try to get people to see that. And several of the projects I saw today really were about provoking people to see the potential of change and see those things that are sort of floating around us but we don't normally engage with.
Yeah, this idea of visibility, of course, is like, throughout, this project, through all the projects, the Lilly Prizes, and photo fellows as well. And as both of you were speaking today, I also started to question, what does one do with visibility? Because I think we're at, we've come out of 20 months, we've come out of 200, 400 years of slavery after slavery, of trying to figure out, like, how do we begin to make visible, and then what, if not solutions, what actions come next. And as you were talking about, like, what you don't design, right? Or what slips into the cracks. I was thinking about Michelle Cohen's comment from the recent Emmys, where she was talking about how it's okay to not be visible. It's okay, to fall back from that performance of visibility. I'm just going to throw that out there as just food for thought, just to think, like, how do we both make visible, and how does one perhaps respect what is not coming forward?
We talk about this constantly in our office, so I'm going to jump on that one. We realize our job sometimes is to be salespeople for doing less. And part of it's our years of working with architects and who, your job is to design objects as the solution for something. But even with what we do, if we want to do less and we know that's the best thing to do, which to me is related to visibility, I hope I'm not taking this in an odd direction, but if the best design solution is to do less or even nothing, how do you make that into something that you're proposing? You're getting paid to propose something creative. So then we have to challenge ourselves to be excellent communicators and storytellers about what's already there. And luckily, that's already in our wheelhouse as designers. But it's a challenge, and it's never been more important.
I think it's a really, really interesting observation. I mean, tying it to when we say we're making things visible, we assume we're doing right by them. But we know we often have done wrong by making things visible. I mean, mapping is a way to control, right? I mean, kind of sort of the taxonomy of what is vernacular. I mean, when the French colonized, Algeria and Morocco, it was like suddenly there was something called Arab or Moorish architecture, but it didn't exist, but it had a name. So then, now that it was named, it could be used to pretend like that colonization was not there. These buildings were built that were Arab-looking to make the French be integrated. So making visible is not always, it is control. So we have to be aware that the tools that we use can both give voice, but they can also expose in a way that now is rendering something even more fragile. Or the idea that we're supposed to constantly perform our identities, perform our, for who, to be reduced how. I think so. I think so. So choosing not to reveal everything, or being aware of our weaknesses and our not being so confident with our capacities to tell stories and their complexity. I think how we approach design in my practice is same thing. We try not to design everything. We're going to touch. We're going to do this, and that, and the rest is just going to happen somehow, or enable things that we're not controlling. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a fascinating thing about the idea of frameworks, design. Maybe, there is a 2.1 we were talking before also, like we were thinking when we were setting up the premise of the project about the idea of the archetype, like Columbus as the archetype, a place that has the bank, the park, the main street, the whole thing, like this mid-century thing, and that kind of like solve or address certain ways like the 20th century, and clearly we're in a completely different way now. So how do one of the questions that we had is like, how do we move forward? Like, does this archetype evolve into the 21st century that is not a singular future, but it's a much more pluralistic and inclusive way of thinking about what and who and how do we move forward? So I think maybe, again, being here, it's kind of like a pretty remarkable moment of what this meant decades ago, and then how do we make things that are as meaningful but in a new way moving forward.
I think that just thinking through archetypes, I was also thinking about the library, and I know, Amal, I would love for you to speak a little bit about this iteration of libraries that you've been doing and sort of thinking about them through a kind of evolving typology.
Yeah, I think it is this idea of continuity and discontinuity that I was mentioning. I think we understand that libraries no longer perform what they used to perform. They don't have the same aura, right, first of all, which is a good thing probably, of like power but they've become gradually places where people come together. They've become places for learning language, for having access to computers or the internet, or under COVID, libraries became vaccination centers. Like they're one of the last few pieces of a kind of publicness in cities. And so I think we've done a number of libraries, and with each one, it's really become, I mean, it's a little common to say, but it's very much about the community. It's one of those projects where you're really thinking about the community, and you know that you're bringing something that could, that does bring different communities together. And there's tension. There's also, we're building a library in Boulder Colorado, and it's the site is NIMBY. There's a kind of condos there. They don't want to hear about it. So it's negotiating still through architecture and through design all these conflicts and these tensions, and so it is one of the few. So I wish we had new typology. I mean, to your point of what can the future hold. Can we think about new typologies? So I'll just give one example, two examples. One is we did a project for RISD, the student center, and originally it was just about a kind of interior renovation to create career services, financial aid, flexible space, etc., for students. And then there was a part of the program that said mailroom, and a mailroom. I'm like, mailroom? Who gets mail now? What, and it turns out the mailroom were their boxes, right? Entire boxes, sometimes food coming from China, and so the mailroom became an opportunity for a mail building to think about the post office, to reinvent the post office as a place where you come together and you have this kind of serendipitous encounters, and then anyway. So I think there is. How do we find opportunity to say, okay, this is a new technology, Amazon is devastating in so many ways, but if we twist it around, could we create a place for people to come together in a new way and not have each individual receive their box at their doorstep, but rather have to go somewhere and have the cardboard recycled. And I think some of the projects today do try to your point, that their provocation not just in terms of questions, their provocation in terms of if we are to build, what should we build? Do we build, habitat for other species? Do we focus on the kids and on play? And I think these are the right questions.
Yeah, I mean, what to build, why to build, like, what could be an architecture that's for, or a landscape that's reparative. So yeah, I think there was ideas of what maybe comes after the big reveal, right? We've made things visible. Now what? And maybe thinking about this idea of reparations, repair, maintenance, healing, but also thinking about it as a kind of like timeline for that. Like I think I say this, and I'm looking at you, Shannon, because I'm also thinking about civic spaces, like as these points, maybe of memorial or of healing, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thinking about where our role as designers are in the timeline on the places that we're working on, we need to be thinking about that differently than we have been. Landscape architecture has oddly, in recent decades, been modeled off of architecture and the way our contracts work, where we're designers, we're in there, the plants go in the ground, everything else gets installed, and we are never allowed on the site again a lot of times. And a lot of times there is zero budget. There'll be a capital budget associated with the building, but zero budget for managing that dynamic landscape that is just beginning. It just was birthed, I can't say that word very well, and then most of them fail within 3 years. So if we're starting ecologies and reparations and things like that, we're starting processes that need to be managed. And again, maybe in the spirit of these installations, I'm not proposing a solution, but it's the question that is urgent that we all need to be talking about. And I know it relates to architecture and other forms of design, shifting more into processes and systems.
Yeah, no, I think I really love the word repair for this moment for architecture. It's very, it's very tangible, most of our projects now have an adaptive reuse, recycle, component. It just and to think about existing buildings as the site and the ground, I think is giving a kind of groundedness to architecture today. I mean, concrete is failing, right? It's 100 years old. This is it. So, how do we repair concrete buildings? This is modernism. And we know it here, right? It's crumbling. And I think these are really crucial questions, because kind of bringing back your question of like, it's so big, yes, but if you look at the site, the ground, the material, the rebar that's rusting, that these are call to actions that are very specific and tangible.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is interesting, and it's come back a few times, that the installations are not answering a question, they're bringing new questions, but in reality, they're also creating these frameworks, these relationships, they're identifying ways of moving forward. But when we look at this idea of they are failing in 3 years, to me it's also interesting now that they have made something visible, now that we have the piece that starts the conversation, like, what's the responsibility of the designers? What's the responsibility of Exhibit Columbus as a place that now you've introduced the conversation? You have the framework, but how do we move that forward? What's the responsibility of a place like Columbus to say, we're hosting these conversations, but hosting them might not advance the conversation, it's just bringing it. So to me, I'm very curious about creating these systems. We have to think them in a different way, so we invest in the next few years. And what is the responsibility of everybody, not just introducing the conversation, but carrying it forward?
I loved Lake's installation, which was not just a kind of archival reveal, but also actually really literally occupied this plaza in front of the library and created this stage set that was, taken over by the performance, and it worked so well. So I think these moments for a city such as Columbus, I would imagine, how do we proliferate these moments of action and of collectivity and not have them happen only, once a year, but, I think it's very powerful to say interventions in this moment of questioning scale, interventions can be of a small scale and yet have a very large impact in terms of the community coming together. So I think it's just opening up opportunities for someone to say, hey, we could do X, Y, and Z, and I think there needs to be a reframing in terms of the scale of buildings today.
I think your question brings into focus the shift we need to make from thinking about ourselves as product designers. That whole word product kind of implies that when we design something, we complete it, and there's this completed object or even idea. And yet these installations aren't pretending to be products. They are meant to be asking or provoking something. So to sustain something, then I imagine you'd be sustaining the conversation that they're starting. So Columbus as a central space for dialogue about design, equity, culture, all these wonderful topics that are being brought together, I imagine as a host, just finding a way to sustain the conversations that are being started, whether it's online or something else. I'll probably make it boring if I try to think of an actual idea. But I think sustaining the dialogue about that given topic would be a great service.
Yeah, I think that this kind of ties together maybe two things for me. One, this question around that Eng brought up that I really liked, that I wrote down, which was process as research. Which I think we may not have been all able to comprehend that we were doing, but it's in action. Combined with, I think, a larger, maybe a larger mission within, say, Landmark Columbus, the questions of progressive preservation. And I think some of what we're talking about in terms of care and repair, but also concrete failing, because it's just aged out and chemically is done, kind of points towards questions of preservation, which might also point to like, how do we, like if I'll just say it. Like if part of the kind of Trojan horse of the project is a role of decolonization, how do we then think about preservation of these difficult, potentially very difficult sites? I'll just make you guys answer that.
Yeah. No, I think this is crucial, and I liked Ang's project in that it also questioned, what gets preserved, and why would we reveal one history and not reveal the history of this bronze glass, and that today we're kind of dismissing, but actually so. I mean, again, I think it seems to me that we shouldn't be too fast, and I think it's important that these histories exist so that they can be rediscovered and learned and unlearned in different ways, and not to just assume that we're done. I think they are all archival material. And to be preserved for future generations. I remember when I was doing my thesis on downtown Beirut, just as the war was ending, and every time they were trying to, there was this sort of these beginning of archaeological digs, and I mean, it was kind of a very interesting alliance between developers and archaeologists, in that both of them wanted to destroy the city so that, either to reveal what was underneath or to build something new, but not to preserve what at the time people thought, oh, it's irrelevant, right? And this Dutch archaeologist I was working with, I asked him, why aren't you opening up more? And he said, but we have to keep some of it for future generations to discover in a different way. So I think we need to reckon with history, but we also need to, be humble in terms of making sure we allow future generations to do their reckoning as well.
Landscape architecture has been going through a good 15 years of really intense arguing about preserving modern landscapes. And I think, I agree that it's a balance. But watching that and frankly, seeing plazas that just don't work anymore for their context and the resources that they're consuming, watch people fight to freeze us in a moment in time, which is what a lot of these installations are questioning. Should we be freezing this blanket we've put over the land of a certain era of thinking? That's made me say out loud and in writing many times, if any of my works stop functioning and stop being beneficial, change it. I don't want my stuff to be around forever. It's not relevant anymore. We need to preserve some things, but I agree about not only making room for the future, but making room for all of the thousands of millions of years of Earth's history that we need to be allowed. We're going to run out of room if we keep preserving everything. So
we've run out of room with this conversation. That was too cheesy. Maybe if there's a question or two, we could take it. Otherwise, we can wrap it, and questions could be asked over coffee.
Or beer.
Or beer. All right, we're going to all make a beeline to the pump house. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, again, thanks to all of our participants today, Shannon and Amale, Iker and Mimi, all of our UDRF fellows, and our committee that was so generous in hosting all of the conversations. Thank you all so much. Closing remarks. Thanks for joining us with the Mapping the Middle and the Design Research Conversations, our first UDRF colloquium
in partnership with the Sid and Lois Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture and Design, and the R. Wayne Estopanol College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State University. Thanks to both of these institutions for supporting our work and partnering with us in this great collaboration. A special thanks to our guests, Amale and Shannon, our UDRF. This event has generously been supported by the Heritage Fund, the Community Foundation of Bartholomew County, through support from the Lilly Endowment Inc, Giving Indiana Funds for Tomorrow grant. So thank you so much for that. To our presenting sponsor, Cummins, of the 2021 exhibition, we really appreciate the support. To all of our board of directors, our founding sponsors, thank you so much for your time, talent, and energy in supporting our work. I just want to thank our team, of course, and we couldn't do this without you guys. So thank you to Exhibit Columbus, Janice Shimizu, Bethany Farrell, Beth Valentine, Hadley Fruits, Jamie Goldsboro, Liz Kubani, and our director, Richard McCoy. The graphics for today and for all of our new middles pieces that we've designed are by Jeremiah Chu of Some All None. Finally, I would like to thank our curators, Mimi Zeiger and Iker Gill, for supporting this 2-year cycle and being such an important part of the work that we've been doing. And so tonight, to continue our party, we are going to join Future Firm at their project, Midnight Palace, and we are going to see Night Shift Spitalfields. It's a film by Julius Caesar McQuarrie. And so another piece of the Miller Prize that will have a program this evening at 8:30. And then again, join us in October 22nd and 23rd for Watershed Weekend. We will have Derek Hoferlin and some guests that he's bringing to town, Angie Tilges and Monique Verdun, to learn more about the Mississippi Watershed and do some field studio work. We will also welcome our photography fellows, Virginia Musick and David Shalil, back for a conversation with Iker Gill. And then we'll also welcome some friends from the Chicago Architecture Biennial. If you would like to hang out downtown, the Fiesta Latina is happening on 4th Street. And thanks again to the Arts Council for the beautiful performance this morning at several of our installations. So thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate it.